Ladies and gentlemen, a person who constantly seeks to dominate your emotions does not simply desire your presence, they desire your energy, your reactions, and your attention. When you finally choose to withdraw from that cycle, you are not just ending communication, you are removing the fuel that kept their sense of control alive. Many people misunderstand this moment. They think cutting someone off is an act of anger, but in truth, it is often an act of awakening. It is the realization that your peace has greater value than constant emotional chaos. Personal boundaries and self-respect are often misunderstood because many people grow up believing that being kind means always being available, always forgiving, and always tolerating behavior that drains them. In reality, a boundary is not a wall meant to punish others. It is a line of clarity that protects your mental and emotional health. When a person learns to set boundaries, they are not becoming cold or selfish. They are becoming aware of their value. Self-respect begins the moment you recognize that your time, your energy, and your peace are limited resources. Just as you would not allow someone to enter your home and rearrange your furniture without permission, you should not allow anyone to constantly disrupt your inner world without consequence. Boundaries teach people how to treat you, but more importantly, they teach you how to treat yourself. They are a declaration that you understand your worth and refuse to negotiate it for temporary approval. Education in emotional health shows that individuals who lack boundaries often experience burnout, resentment, and confusion. They give endlessly, hoping that their generosity will be appreciated, yet they receive little in return. Over time, this imbalance creates emotional exhaustion. When you finally decide to establish limits, it can feel uncomfortable because you are breaking a pattern that may have existed for years. However, discomfort is often the first sign of growth. Just as muscles ache before they become stronger, your emotional strength develops when you practice saying no, when you choose silence instead of arguments, and when you step away from situations that diminish your spirit. This is not cruelty, it is wisdom. You are not rejecting people, you are rejecting behaviors that harm you. Self-respect also changes the way you communicate. Instead of pleading to be understood, you speak with calm confidence. Instead of reacting impulsively, you respond thoughtfully. This shift in behavior is powerful because it removes emotional chaos and replaces it with clarity. People who once relied on your emotional reactions may find this new calm unsettling because it signals independence. You are no longer easily controlled by guilt, fear, or manipulation. You become grounded, and grounded individuals are difficult to shake. This stability does not come from arrogance. It comes from understanding that your identity is not defined by others' opinions. You no longer chase validation because you have learned to validate yourself. Another important aspect of boundaries is consistency. Setting a limit once is not enough, maintaining it is what creates real change. Many people establish boundaries but abandon them the moment they feel pressure or emotional discomfort. True self-respect requires persistence. It means reminding yourself that protecting your peace is not a one-time decision, but a daily practice. Each time you honor your limits, you strengthen your confidence. Each time you ignore them, you weaken your sense of control. Consistency teaches others that your standards are not temporary moods, but permanent values. Over time, the people who genuinely respect you will adjust, while those who benefited from your lack of limits may drift away. This separation is not a loss. It is a natural filtering process that makes room for healthier relationships. From a psychological perspective, boundaries also help you rediscover your identity. When you constantly prioritize others, you may lose sight of your own needs, interests, and goals. Establishing limits creates space for self-reflection. You begin to ask important questions. What do I enjoy? What drains me? What inspires me? This self-inquiry is essential for personal growth because it reconnects you with your authentic self. You start making decisions based on alignment rather than obligation. Life becomes less about pleasing others and more about living with intention. This transformation does not make you less compassionate, it makes your compassion sustainable. You can give without feeling depleted because you are no longer giving from emptiness. Ultimately, personal boundaries and self-respect are acts of emotional maturity. They show that you understand balance, the balance between generosity and self-care, between patience and firmness, between love for others and love for yourself. When you respect yourself, you send a silent message to the world that your presence is valuable and your peace is non-negotiable. This mindset does not isolate you, it attracts healthier connections because confident, self-aware individuals tend to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than control or dependency. The journey towards strong boundaries is not about pushing people away. It is about standing firmly within yourself. When you learn this lesson, you realize that self-respect is not an attitude you display occasionally. It is a lifestyle you live every day, shaping your choices, your relationships, and your future with quiet but undeniable strength. Personal boundaries and self-respect are often misunderstood as harshness or selfishness. Yet in reality, they are expressions of emotional intelligence and inner maturity. A boundary is not a wall built to keep people out. It is a line drawn to protect what is valuable within. When an individual learns to say no without guilt and yes without fear, they begin to reclaim authority over their own life. Many people grow up believing that love requires endless tolerance, but education in emotional health reveals a different truth. Love without limits becomes self-neglect. Self-respect is the internal compass that reminds you your time, energy, and emotional stability are not resources for unlimited consumption. It teaches that generosity should come from strength, not from exhaustion. When someone constantly crosses your emotional lines, ignoring your needs and manipulating your responses, the absence of boundaries becomes an open invitation for continued harm. Establishing limits is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of responsibility toward your mental well-being. It requires courage because it challenges the fear of rejection and the discomfort of change. Yet once practiced, it produces clarity. You begin to notice who respects your space and who only valued your availability. Boundaries also create healthier communication because they remove ambiguity. Instead of silent resentment, there is honest expression. Instead of internal conflict, there is alignment between thought and action. This alignment strengthens self-respect, and self-respect transforms the way others perceive and treat you. People respond differently when they sense you value yourself. Your posture changes, your tone changes, your decisions become deliberate rather than reactive. Education in this area shows that emotional strength is not about dominance, it is about discipline. Discipline over your reactions, your accessibility, and your emotional investments. When you respect yourself, you teach others how to respect you without uttering a single lecture. Over time, this practice reduces anxiety because you are no longer trying to please everyone at the expense of your own peace. You become selective, intentional, and grounded. This is not isolation, it is intelligent connection. You are not closing doors, you are choosing which doors deserve to remain open. The result is a life that feels lighter, more controlled, and deeply authentic because your actions reflect your values rather than your fears. Independence, particularly emotional independence, is another transformative force that weakens manipulative influence and restores personal power. Emotional independence does not mean detachment from all relationships. It means the ability to stand firm in your identity regardless of external approval. Many manipulative dynamics thrive on dependency. When someone believes they cannot function without another's validation, guidance, or attention, they unknowingly surrender control of their decisions and emotions. Education in personal independence reveals that reliance should be balanced, not absolute. Healthy relationships are partnerships, not ownerships. When you cultivate independence, you develop skills of self-soothing, self-motivation, and self-evaluation. You learn to process disappointment without collapsing and to celebrate achievements without seeking permission. This internal stability reduces vulnerability to emotional manipulation because influence loses its leverage when fear of abandonment disappears. Independence also sharpens critical thinking. Instead of absorbing every opinion, you begin to question, analyze, and decide based on logic and personal values. This intellectual freedom strengthens emotional resilience. You stop reacting impulsively and start responding thoughtfully. The more you invest in your growth, learning new skills, building supportive networks, pursuing meaningful goals, the less power external negativity holds over you. Independence shifts your focus from seeking acceptance to creating purpose. You become less concerned with being understood by everyone and more committed to understanding yourself. This transformation is gradual but deeply empowering. It teaches that your worth is inherent, not assigned by others. As independence grows, fear diminishes. You realize that walking away from unhealthy attachments does not lead to emptiness. It leads to expansion. Your world becomes larger because your confidence no longer depends on a single source of affirmation. This mindset dismantles manipulation because manipulation feeds on insecurity. When insecurity fades, control mechanisms lose effectiveness. Ultimately, independence is not isolation from others. It is liberation from internal doubts that once made you easy to influence. It allows you to engage in relationships by choice rather than by necessity, creating connections based on mutual respect instead of emotional obligation. Emotional dependency and psychological control often develop so subtly that many people do not realize they are trapped until they attempt to step away. In relationships shaped by manipulation, one person gradually becomes the emotional center, while the other becomes the emotional supplier. This imbalance is not always loud or aggressive. Sometimes it is disguised as care, concern, or constant attention. Over time, the dependent individual begins to measure their worth by how much they are needed, while the controlling individual measures their power by how much influence they hold. When separation occurs, the emotional structure that once seemed strong begins to reveal its fragility. The reason is simple: anything built on dependency rather than mutual respect lacks true stability. Education in this context means recognizing patterns instead of reacting to feelings alone. It means understanding that psychological control thrives in confusion, and clarity becomes the first step toward freedom. When a person learns to identify emotional manipulation, they stop seeing themselves as victims and start seeing themselves as decision makers. This shift transforms the entire dynamic because awareness removes the invisible chains that once held the relationship together. The collapse that follows is not an act of revenge, but the natural consequence of removing an unhealthy foundation. The power of personal boundaries and self-respect becomes evident the moment someone decides they deserve peace more than approval. Boundaries are not walls built to keep people out. They are guidelines that teach others how to treat you. Many individuals fear setting boundaries because they worry about rejection or conflict. Yet the absence of boundaries often leads to deeper pain and long-term emotional exhaustion. Self-respect grows when a person realizes that saying no is not cruelty but clarity. It is the declaration that one's time, energy, and mental well-being have value. In educational terms, boundaries function like rules in a classroom. Without them, chaos dominates. With them, growth becomes possible. When a person consistently maintains these limits, they begin to attract healthier interactions and repel harmful ones. This is not coincidence, it is alignment. Respect is rarely given to those who constantly abandon themselves to satisfy others. Instead, respect emerges when individuals demonstrate that they are not afraid to protect their emotional space. The internal transformation is even more powerful than the external change. Confidence replaces hesitation, and calm replaces anxiety. The person who once felt controlled begins to feel centered. Over time, this self-respect becomes a guiding principle in all areas of life, influencing decisions, relationships, and even career paths. The collapse of a manipulative dynamic often occurs because boundaries remove access to emotional exploitation. When access is limited, control weakens. The individual who once relied on constant influence finds themselves facing a reality they cannot easily shape, while the person who set the boundary discovers a strength they did not know they possessed. Silence and distance create clarity in ways that constant conversation never can. Noise often disguises truth, while quiet reveals it. When communication is continuous, emotions remain stirred, and the mind struggles to analyze situations objectively. Distance, however, acts like a lens that sharpens perception. It allows individuals to observe patterns, recognize inconsistencies, and evaluate relationships without the pressure of immediate reaction. Silence is frequently misunderstood as weakness, yet it is one of the strongest forms of communication because it refuses to engage in unnecessary conflict. Educationally, silence teaches emotional discipline. It shows that not every provocation deserves a response, and not every accusation requires defense. This discipline develops maturity and strengthens decision-making skills. Distance also restores personal energy. Emotional entanglement drains focus and creativity, while separation renews them. People often discover new interests, talents, and goals once they step away from toxic influences. The clarity gained through silence is not merely about understanding others. It is about understanding oneself. It becomes easier to distinguish between genuine care and conditional attention, between support and control. As clarity grows, so does independence. The person who once felt lost in another's expectations begins to define their own direction. The collapse that occurs on the other side is not caused by hostility, but by absence. When manipulation loses its audience, it loses its strength. Meanwhile, the one who embraced silence gains insight, stability, and emotional balance. In this quiet space, growth becomes inevitable because reflection replaces reaction and wisdom replaces confusion. Understanding emotional dependency and psychological control is essential because many people do not realize they are trapped in a cycle until they step outside of it. Emotional dependency is not always obvious. It often disguises itself as loyalty, love, or responsibility. Over time, however, it becomes clear that one person is constantly adjusting their behavior, words, and even thoughts to avoid conflict or disapproval. This creates an invisible chain where freedom slowly disappears. Psychological control works quietly. It is not always loud or aggressive. Sometimes it is subtle, using guilt, confusion, or selective affection to keep someone emotionally off balance. When a person finally recognizes this pattern, awareness becomes the first step toward liberation. Education in this area is about recognizing the difference between healthy connection and emotional captivity. A healthy bond allows growth and independence, while psychological control demands submission and fear. The moment you understand this distinction, you begin to see how your emotional energy has been used, and that awareness alone weakens the hold others may have over you. The power of personal boundaries and self-respect cannot be overstated because boundaries act as the architecture of a stable life. Without them, people drift into situations that drain their confidence and blur their identity. Boundaries are not walls meant to isolate. They are lines that define what is acceptable and what is not. Self-respect grows when these lines are honored consistently. Many individuals struggle with guilt when setting limits, believing they are being harsh or unkind. In reality, boundaries are a form of self-education. They teach you that your time, energy, and emotional well-being are valuable resources, not unlimited supplies for others to consume. When you enforce boundaries calmly and firmly, you send a message not only to others, but also to yourself that you are worthy of dignity. This internal message reshapes behavior, posture, and even the way you speak. Over time, self-respect becomes visible in your decisions. You stop explaining yourself excessively, you stop seeking constant approval, and you begin to choose environments that align with your peace. Boundaries do not push people away. They attract those who value mutual respect, while naturally filtering out those who depend on control or manipulation. Why silence and distance create clarity is a lesson many people learn only after enduring emotional noise for too long. Constant communication in unhealthy dynamics often leads to confusion rather than understanding. Arguments repeat themselves, explanations lose meaning, and emotional reactions overshadow rational thought. Silence interrupts this cycle. It gives the mind space to observe rather than react. Distance, whether emotional or physical, acts like stepping back from a painting to finally see the full image. When you are too close, you only notice fragments. When you step away, patterns become visible. This clarity is educational because it reveals truths that were previously hidden by emotional intensity. Silence also shifts power. It removes the expectation that you must always respond, defend, or justify your choices. In that quiet space, confidence begins to rebuild because you are no longer measuring your worth through constant interaction. Distance allows healing to start, and healing brings perspective. You begin to realize which conversations were necessary and which were merely draining rituals. The clarity that emerges is not just about others. It is about yourself. You rediscover your preferences, your goals, and your voice without external interference. The rebuilding of identity after separation is perhaps the most transformative stage because it marks the shift from survival to growth. When a person has been emotionally entangled for a long time, their identity often becomes intertwined with the relationship itself. Decisions are influenced by fear of conflict or desire for approval rather than genuine personal choice. Separation, though initially uncomfortable, creates an empty space where identity can be reconstructed with intention. This process is not instant. It requires patience and self-reflection. Education plays a key role here because you begin to learn who you are outside of external expectations. You explore interests that were neglected, reconnect with passions that were silenced, and develop new skills that build confidence. Gradually, self-trust returns. You start to rely on your judgment rather than waiting for validation. This rebuilding is like strengthening a foundation that was previously cracked. Each small decision made independently adds another layer of stability. Over time, the person you become is not merely a recovered version of your old self, but a more aware and resilient individual. Identity rebuilding teaches that loss can become opportunity and that detachment can be the beginning of self-discovery rather than the end of connection. Understanding emotional dependency is the first major lesson in breaking free from destructive relationship cycles. Emotional dependency forms when a person slowly begins to believe their happiness, stability, or sense of worth depends on another individual's approval or presence. This dependency is rarely obvious at the beginning. It grows quietly through repeated patterns of seeking validation, avoiding conflict to keep peace, and ignoring personal discomfort to maintain connection. Over time, the dependent individual may start to suppress their own opinions, emotions, and even dreams just to prevent disapproval. Education in this area teaches that emotional strength comes from internal balance, not external reassurance. When a person learns to validate themselves, they no longer become vulnerable to manipulation or emotional control. They begin to understand that relationships should complement life, not control it. This awareness alone can dramatically change how someone interacts with others and how they protect their emotional well-being. The power of personal boundaries is another transformative principle. Boundaries are not walls meant to push people away. They are guidelines that define what behavior is acceptable and what is not. Many individuals struggle with boundaries because they fear being perceived as rude, selfish, or unkind. However, the absence of boundaries often leads to emotional exhaustion, resentment, and loss of self-identity. Learning to say no, to limit access to one's time and energy, and to protect personal values is not aggression. It is self-respect in action. When someone establishes boundaries, they communicate clarity about their standards and expectations. This clarity removes confusion and reduces the opportunity for others to exploit emotional generosity. Boundaries also create mutual respect in healthy relationships because they encourage honesty and accountability. Without them, relationships become imbalanced and emotionally draining. With them, relationships become structured, respectful, and sustainable. Silence and distance play a surprisingly powerful educational role in personal growth. Many people are conditioned to believe that every conflict must be addressed immediately with words, explanations, and emotional reactions. Yet silence often provides the space necessary for clarity and emotional regulation. Distance allows individuals to step back from emotional storms and observe situations objectively rather than react impulsively. In moments of separation, people begin to recognize patterns they previously ignored. They start to see the emotional triggers, the cycles of manipulation, and the ways their responses contributed to ongoing conflict. Silence is not weakness. It is a strategic pause that gives the mind room to analyze and the heart room to heal. Distance is not abandonment. It is an opportunity for self-evaluation. Together, they function as tools for emotional maturity. When someone learns the value of stepping back instead of rushing forward, they gain control over their reactions and prevent unnecessary emotional damage. Another important lesson is recognizing the illusion of control that often exists in unhealthy dynamics. Control in relationships rarely appears as direct commands. It is usually disguised as guilt, fear, or obligation. One person may feel pressured to act a certain way to avoid conflict or rejection, believing they are making free choices when in reality they are responding to emotional manipulation. Understanding this illusion requires critical self-reflection and awareness. When individuals begin to question why they feel anxious, why they fear displeasing someone, or why they hesitate to express themselves, they start uncovering hidden influences over their behavior. Education in this area reveals that true control belongs to the person who governs their emotions, decisions, and reactions, not the one who influences others through pressure or intimidation. Once the illusion is exposed, its power diminishes. People who see through emotional control gain the courage to act according to their values rather than their fears. Finally, rebuilding identity after emotional detachment is one of the most profound stages of personal development. When a person has spent a long period adjusting their personality, interests, or behaviors to satisfy someone else, they may struggle to remember who they truly are. Detachment becomes a rediscovery process. It involves reconnecting with forgotten hobbies, personal goals, and inner passions. This stage requires patience because identity reconstruction is not immediate, it is gradual and layered. Individuals learn to trust their own decisions again, to enjoy their own company, and to invest energy into self-improvement rather than constant approval seeking. Education during this phase emphasizes self-awareness, emotional independence, and long-term vision. People begin to design lives aligned with their authentic values instead of external expectations. The result is a stronger, more confident identity that no longer depends on others for validation. This transformation does not only change relationships, it changes the entire direction of a person's life, creating resilience, clarity, and a deeper understanding of personal worth. Understanding emotional dependency and psychological control begins with recognizing how subtle influence can slowly shape a person's thoughts, decisions, and self-image. Emotional dependency does not always start as weakness. It often begins as trust, admiration, or the desire for connection. Over time, however, when one individual constantly seeks validation or approval from another, the balance of power shifts. Psychological control thrives in this imbalance because the dependent person starts to question their own judgment and relies heavily on external reassurance. Education about this dynamic is essential because awareness breaks illusion. When a person learns to identify manipulation, guilt tripping, or emotional pressure, they regain the ability to think independently. The moment clarity enters the mind, control begins to weaken, because influence cannot survive where understanding is present. The power of personal boundaries and self-respect is one of the most transformative lessons a person can learn. Boundaries are not walls meant to isolate. They are lines that define dignity. Many people hesitate to set limits because they fear rejection or conflict, yet the absence of boundaries often invites disrespect and emotional exhaustion. Self-respect teaches that saying no is not cruelty, it is self-preservation. When individuals begin to value their time, emotions, and mental peace, they send a clear message that their identity is not available for manipulation. This internal shift changes how others respond because people naturally adjust their behavior according to the standards they are shown. A person who respects themselves silently educates the world on how they expect to be treated. Over time, this creates healthier interactions and strengthens confidence, making it harder for toxic influence to re-enter their life. Silence and distance create clarity in ways that constant communication never can. When emotions are intense, conversations often become reactive rather than productive. Distance allows the mind to settle, like water becoming still after a storm. In that stillness, truth becomes visible. Silence is not weakness. It is a strategic pause that allows reflection and emotional regulation. Without continuous noise, the brain begins to process events logically rather than emotionally. This clarity helps individuals distinguish between genuine care and manipulative behavior. It also restores personal energy that was previously drained by conflict or overthinking. Many discover during this quiet period that their strength was never lost. It was simply overshadowed by emotional chaos. Distance becomes a teacher, revealing patterns, habits, and emotional triggers that were once hidden by constant interaction. The illusion of control that manipulative individuals try to maintain is often fragile and dependent on others' reactions. Control is rarely about physical dominance. It is usually emotional and psychological. When someone feels powerful only because they can provoke, influence, or predict another person's behavior, their sense of authority is borrowed, not earned. The illusion survives as long as the other person continues to respond emotionally. Once reactions stop, the illusion begins to fade. This teaches an important educational principle. True power comes from self-mastery, not from controlling others. People who rely on external control often struggle when faced with independence because they are forced to confront their own insecurities. Recognizing this illusion empowers individuals to detach without guilt, understanding that they are not destroying anyone's stability. They are simply refusing to participate in a false structure. Emotional withdrawal as a form of self-protection is frequently misunderstood. Society sometimes labels withdrawal as avoidance. Yet there is a significant difference between running away and stepping back for healing. Emotional withdrawal becomes necessary when continuous interaction causes stress, anxiety, or loss of identity. It is an act of safeguarding mental health rather than abandoning responsibility. This process allows individuals to reconnect with their own needs, passions, and goals that may have been neglected. It also provides space for emotional recovery, much like rest is required after physical exertion. Through withdrawal, a person learns to prioritize well-being over approval. This lesson reinforces resilience because it teaches that protecting one's peace is not selfish. It is essential for long-term growth and stability. Rebuilding identity after separation is perhaps the most powerful stage of personal transformation. When someone has spent a long time under emotional influence, they may lose sight of their individuality. Separation becomes an opportunity to rediscover values, interests, and ambitions that were once overshadowed. This rebuilding process involves self-reflection, learning new skills, and forming healthier connections. It is not instant. It requires patience and consistency. However, each small step, choosing personal goals, developing new routines, or strengthening self-confidence, contributes to a stronger sense of self. Over time, individuals realize that their identity was never defined by another person's perception. Instead, it is shaped by their own choices and beliefs. This realization fosters independence and emotional maturity, ensuring that future relationships are built on equality rather than dependency. The result is not merely recovery, but evolution into a more self-aware and empowered individual. Emotional dependency and psychological control often develop so gradually that many people do not recognize they are trapped until they feel exhausted, confused, or constantly questioning their own worth. Emotional dependency is not simply about loving someone deeply. It becomes unhealthy when your sense of identity, happiness, and stability rely entirely on another person's approval or reaction. Psychological control, on the other hand, is the silent force that keeps this dependency alive. It appears through guilt, manipulation, silent treatments, and subtle intimidation rather than open commands. Over time, a person under this influence begins to doubt their own judgment and may even fear making independent decisions. Education about this dynamic is crucial because awareness is the first step toward freedom. When you understand that emotional control is not love, but influence disguised as affection, you begin to separate your emotions from the manipulator's expectations. This separation restores clarity and helps you recognize that healthy relationships encourage independence rather than punish it. Personal boundaries and self-respect act as protective walls around your emotional well-being. Many people are taught to be endlessly forgiving, accommodating, and self-sacrificing, believing these traits define kindness. However, without boundaries, kindness becomes vulnerability to exploitation. Boundaries are not acts of aggression, they are statements of self-value. They communicate what you will and will not tolerate without needing to raise your voice. Self-respect grows when you honor your limits consistently, even when it feels uncomfortable. The educational aspect of boundaries lies in discipline. You train your mind to understand that protecting your peace is not selfish but necessary. Over time, you begin to notice a change in how others treat you because your internal standards influence external behavior. When you respect yourself, you unconsciously teach others how to respect you as well. Silence and distance often appear passive, yet they are among the most powerful forms of communication. Silence removes emotional fuel from conflicts that thrive on reaction. Distance provides space for reflection, healing, and clarity. When individuals are constantly surrounded by noise, opinions, and emotional pressure, they struggle to hear their own thoughts. Silence acts like a reset button for the mind. It allows emotions to settle and logic to re-emerge. Distance, whether emotional or physical, reduces the intensity of influence and reveals patterns that were once hidden by closeness. This process is educational because it strengthens self-awareness. You learn to observe rather than immediately react. You begin to respond with intention instead of impulse. In this quiet space, personal truth becomes louder than external manipulation. Many controlling personalities survive on the illusion of power rather than actual strength. Their confidence often depends on how effectively they can influence others, not on genuine self-assurance. The illusion works because it creates fear or dependency in those around them. However, illusions cannot withstand independence. When a person stops responding to intimidation or emotional pressure, the perceived power begins to fade. Education here comes from recognizing that authority over your emotions is never truly owned by another person unless you surrender it. The moment you reclaim your emotional autonomy, the illusion loses its grip. You realize that their strength was never absolute. It was conditional on your participation. Emotional withdrawal is frequently misunderstood as coldness, but in many situations, it is an act of self-protection. Just as the body withdraws from a hot surface to avoid injury, the mind withdraws from emotional harm to preserve stability. This withdrawal is not about revenge or punishment, it is about healing. It allows the nervous system to recover from constant stress and restores emotional balance. Through this process, you learn the importance of conserving emotional energy. You begin to invest your feelings where they are valued rather than wasted. The educational lesson is that emotional availability should be selective, not automatic. Protecting your emotional space is a sign of maturity, not indifference. Independence weakens manipulative influence because manipulation relies on need. When you reduce emotional reliance on someone who seeks control, their primary tool disappears. Independence does not mean isolation, it means the ability to stand confidently without constant reassurance. This strength grows through personal development, learning new skills, building supportive networks, and trusting your own decisions. Education in independence teaches resilience. You begin to understand that confidence is not loud or boastful. It is quiet certainty in your ability to navigate life without being dominated by another person's approval. Rebuilding identity after separation is one of the most transformative experiences a person can undergo. In unhealthy dynamics, identity often becomes blurred, shaped by another person's preferences, criticisms, or expectations. Separation provides an opportunity to rediscover personal interests, values, and dreams that may have been suppressed. This rebuilding process is educational because it reconnects you with authenticity. You start to ask meaningful questions about who you are, what you enjoy, and what future you desire. As identity strengthens, confidence naturally follows. The result is not merely recovery, but evolution. A stronger, wiser, and more self-aware individual who understands that true power lies not in controlling others, but in mastering oneself. Understanding emotional dependency and psychological control begins with recognizing how subtle influence can shape a person's thoughts, decisions, and even identity over time. Emotional dependency is rarely obvious at the start. It often develops through repeated patterns where one individual becomes the constant source of validation, approval, or reassurance for another. This dynamic slowly shifts power away from mutual respect and toward imbalance. Psychological control thrives in environments where one person doubts their own judgment and seeks external permission to feel secure. Education in this area means learning to observe behaviors rather than just words, to notice when communication leaves you confused, drained, or uncertain about your worth. When awareness grows, dependency weakens, because knowledge shines light on manipulation that once operated in the shadows. The power of personal boundaries and self-respect is one of the most transformative lessons a person can learn. Boundaries are not walls meant to isolate. They are guidelines that teach others how to treat you and remind you how to treat yourself. Self-respect is the internal agreement that your time, energy, and emotional well-being are valuable resources, not unlimited supplies. Many people struggle with boundaries because they fear rejection or conflict, yet the absence of boundaries often leads to deeper pain and resentment. True strength lies in calmly and clearly expressing limits without guilt. This practice does not diminish kindness. It refines it. When boundaries are consistently upheld, relationships either evolve into healthier forms or naturally fall away, both outcomes serving personal growth rather than harm. Silence and distance create clarity because they remove constant emotional noise. When communication is filled with arguments, justifications, and endless explanations, the mind becomes clouded. Distance acts like fresh air entering a closed room. It clears confusion and allows thoughts to settle. Silence is not weakness or avoidance. It is a deliberate pause that allows emotions to cool and reason to return. In this quiet space, individuals often rediscover their own voice, opinions, and desires that were previously overshadowed. Clarity emerges not from louder conversations, but from intentional stillness, where reflection replaces reaction and understanding replaces impulse. The illusion of control is another powerful concept to understand. Some individuals attempt to maintain dominance through emotional pressure, guilt, or constant monitoring, believing that control guarantees security. However, control is fragile because it depends entirely on another person's participation. The moment that participation ends, the illusion shatters. Recognizing this illusion is liberating because it reveals that true stability cannot be forced. It must be built on mutual trust and respect. When control is exposed as temporary and unreliable, individuals begin to value cooperation and independence over dominance. Emotional withdrawal as a form of self-protection is often misunderstood as cruelty, but in reality it can be an act of preservation. Just as the body instinctively pulls away from physical harm, the mind and heart must sometimes step back from emotional harm. Withdrawal is not about punishing another person. It is about restoring balance within oneself. It allows healing to begin, giving space for reflection and recovery. Without this protective distance, emotional exhaustion can become chronic, affecting confidence, decision-making, and overall well-being. Healthy withdrawal teaches the important lesson that self-care is not selfish, it is essential. Independence weakens manipulative influence because manipulation relies heavily on emotional reliance. When a person develops confidence, financial stability, social support, and emotional resilience, the leverage others once held begins to fade. Independence does not mean isolation. It means the ability to stand firm without constant reassurance. It encourages critical thinking, self-trust, and accountability. As independence grows, decisions become guided by personal values rather than external pressure. This shift reduces vulnerability to guilt tactics or emotional coercion, replacing fear with empowerment and uncertainty with assurance. Rebuilding identity after separation is a deeply educational journey. Many people discover that parts of their personality were shaped by the expectations or criticisms of others. Separation becomes an opportunity to rediscover passions, interests, and strengths that were neglected. Identity rebuilding involves experimentation, learning new skills, reconnecting with supportive communities, and redefining personal goals. This process can be uncomfortable because it requires confronting insecurities and embracing change, yet it is also profoundly rewarding. Each step taken independently reinforces the understanding that identity is not assigned by others but cultivated from within. Long-term personal growth through detachment reveals that letting go is not the end of connection, but the beginning of transformation. Detachment teaches patience, emotional regulation, and self-awareness. Over time, individuals notice improvements in mental clarity, confidence, and relationship choices. They become more selective with their energy and more intentional with their time. Growth achieved through detachment is sustainable because it is rooted in internal development rather than external approval. The lessons learned extend far beyond a single relationship, influencing future decisions and interactions. Ultimately, detachment becomes a foundation for maturity, resilience, and a deeper understanding of personal worth, proving that sometimes the most powerful progress begins with the courage to step away. Ultimately, when you remove yourself from a harmful dynamic, you are not causing another person's downfall. You are choosing alignment with truth. If their world feels like it is collapsing, it is because it was built on unstable foundations. A life constructed on control cannot stand when control is gone. Meanwhile, a life built on self-respect becomes unshakable. The lesson is simple yet powerful. When you reclaim your emotional freedom, you do not lose power, you discover it.